Oh, hi. Oh, hello.
Hey,
Calling.
calling Chris Anderson in London.
This is Chris Anderson in London for two shows running. It's just kind of a record recently.
Yeah, I
Calling
think
Rick
it may
Byer.
actually be a record.
Calling Rick Byer in. It looks like Chicago.
I am here in Chicago. Chris, I
Wow.
noticed that you were out for curry the other day when you
I
came
was.
across this.
Yeah, that's
And we're looking at a
that's
picture of Chris in front of a burger joint called Band of Burgers.
which is just wrong in so many
Wrong
ways.
on many counts. Did you go in and lay waste?
No, now I kind of regret it because I have the sneaking suspicion there'd be like a Winter's burger and Garnier fries or something, but I didn't.
I
No.
think you right. I think you need to go in and do that at some point. You need to
A
full
tough one.
report to everyone.
Yeah.
We want to welcome everybody to History Happy Hour, which we are not going to rename Band of Burgers. Brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours, and whether you're watching live or catching us after the fact, thank you for being here. And today our topic is going to be the first Vietnam War, the one before the one that we were in,
Yeah,
from 1945 to 1954, Vietnam versus France. But Chris, we also have a special reveal
we
at the
do.
top of today's show.
Is it two drum rolls then for the show, or are you just
Well,
gonna
you
like
know,
hit the
we can't
button?
do two drum rolls.
All right, so I just
That
hit
would
the
be
button.
wrong. But we'll just
Yep.
say that, ladies and gentlemen, there now exists in the universe
There you
History
go. And
Happy
everybody
Hour
needs one.
hats, and
Yes.
everybody needs one. And I'm going to put
Yeah.
mine on, and it's going
I
to
wish I could
really
put mine
mess
on.
up my
Why can't I
headphones
put
and
mine
everything.
on, Rick?
So there you go, History Happy Hour hat.
Uh,
There you go, and check out the
I,
wrong side. Check out
yeah,
website on the side. Now you might wonder how you can get one of these bad
you
boys.
might. You
And
might.
one way is to become a five-time guest. Might be a high
Okay.
bar for some of
Yep.
you, but
Yeah.
five-time guests, we're going to give them a hat. A second way would be to join us as a top shelf patron on patreon.com. If you are already a top shelf patron, you should have gotten an email about your hat. If you're not, hey, just go to patreon.com, upgrade to a top shelf, or become a patron. And this is a brash, bald marketing
Ball.
fundraising
Disc ball.
move. No subtlety here involved whatsoever. And but you can get your hat by becoming a top shelf patron at patreon.com, and then we insist that you wear it and send us a picture of yourself in it. Oh my gosh, Chris, is anybody watching while
I
we're
think
doing
we
all
have
this
quite a
self
few people
promotion
watching.
and
Yes.
fundraising and whatever
Yeah.
we're doing? Who's
Yeah.
out there?
David from Philadelphia and Lynn from Vermont. Doug from Exton, PA, and Nancy from deep in the heart of Texas. So yeah,
Xavier from Barcelona.
yeah, we have our. Well, we can't start without Xavier. That's kind of a
I
rule.
know we can't start without Xavier, and we got lots of other folks here too. Please, guys, let us know what you're drinking today, what your cocktail is, and Chris, why don't you get us started on moving forward and getting out of this part of the
Well, I
program?
think we should probably talk about our guest and
Well, I think we should run our open first.
Oh well, yeah, it's always helpful. Right?
Yeah,
All right. The
the
bar is
bar
now.
is open, and now you can talk
Now I
about our
can talk about
guest.
our guest. Yes. Well, our guest this week is Christopher Goscha, and he is a professor of international relations in the history department at the Université du Québec à Montreal. He's a leading expert on the Cold War in Asia and the wars in Vietnam, and his books include Vietnam: A New History. And he lives in Montreal, where we're told it's very snowy. Hey, Christopher, how are you
Hey,
doing?
Chris, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing well. I'm doing very
Welcome.
well. Thank you very much.
And I'm required by History Happy Hour precedent to ask you if you've brought a cocktail with you today.
I have brought a little. I'm in my office here, so we can't bring cocktails in here. I'm totally for the idea of having a cocktail, but I do have a little bit of a Coke here, until I can get to a cocktail when I get home a little bit later.
So if there's anybody from the university watching, that is in fact a Coke and not anything else. So
That is at least what we've been told.
yes,
And
That's
Chris,
that's right.
what have you got,
and
Chris?
I have a Cobra, which
Ooh.
is left over from the curry that I had last night when I bumped into that unfortunate burger joint. So
Oh, that's awkward. And I have an escapist IPA
there you
because
go.
this
Nice,
whole show is
nice.
an exercise in escapism. But before we pummel Chris, with questions, we should just mention that his new book is called The Road to Dien Bien Phu, which, of course, was the showdown battle between the Vietnamese and the French in 1954. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Mr. Anderson, start us off.
Yeah, well, before the show, we were all talking, and as some of you who are watching know, my daughter Madeline went to a French school, and I remember one day after school, she came home and she was talking about Vietnam, and we were talking about America's war in Vietnam, and I mentioned, well, the French were there too, and she was really surprised by this, and I said, well, you go to a French school. Why don't they tell you about this in your French school? And she didn't have a good answer. So, Christopher, maybe you could tell us, just for the edification of my daughter, what are the French doing in Vietnam?
Yeah, well, I would say that as we were saying a little bit before we got started, the Indochina War from 1945 to 54 for the French, between the French and the Vietnamese, is still something of a black hole in France. The French write a lot. They're very interested in the Algerian War, which was the war after the first Indochina War from 1954 to 1962. But it's a black hole. I've worked on this war in French, and then in particular here in English in the book that you have here. I would say the other thing about what your daughter said, she has kind of one foot in the French world there, and I think she's right. It's a black hole. I think she has one foot maybe in the American world. I think both of you would agree with me and our guests as well. The Vietnam War dominates. It dominates in the number of books that are produced. It dominates the films, the books, that sort of thing, the way Hollywood's presented it. So it's hard. So I guess that first Indochina War, the French War, if you will, kind of gets lost and kind of garbled up and swallowed up by the American War.
Yeah.
Chris, maybe you can give us a little following up on. I have two Chris's today, so
yeah, it's gonna be a little.
Hopefully, we'll be able to distinguish.
I'm sure it probably can.
I know, Chris, that you're a renowned and respected scholar in this area, and Chris, I'm talking about our guest, not.
Yes, and the other Chris is not, so
Okay.
that's a good buff. Yeah.
And you've been working on this book for the last 15 years. Plus, you speak English, French, and Vietnamese. You're two languages two and a half ahead of me. And so you've really been able to dive into the primary sources. But start us with historical and geographical context. As Chris said, what are the French doing in Indochina? Or is Indochina the same thing as Vietnam? But kind of catch us up from the French being there up until about 1945.
Yeah, no, you've got a good point there. I guess, the 19th century, the French and the British and the Dutch as well, they were increasingly involved in Southeast Asia and in East Asia. So a lot of your listeners know that the British, they took Hong Kong, for example, in 1842. The French were looking to get kind of their Hong Kong, if you like. So they started shopping around, if I could put it that way, in Southeast Asia, and they used force, they used their navy, and they attacked southern Vietnam. So if you look at that map there, you have the Tonkin, and then you have Annam, and then Cochin China in the south. All three of those together kind of make the S form of Vietnam. And to the west, you have Laos, as you can see, and then you have Cambodia. The map is in French, but I think you can make it out here. So the French, they attack in the late 1850s in southern Vietnam, Saigon, which you can see down there at the bottom of the map. They're going to attack in the late 1850s. And then in the 1860s, they're going to move in. All of this was by force, moving against the Vietnamese who are trying to stop them. They'll move into Cambodia in the 1860s. They'll colonize southern Vietnam or Cochin China, Cambodia. And then over the course of the next 20 years, for all sorts of political reasons that are kind of linked to what's going on in Europe as well, by the 1880s, they'll conquer central Vietnam, and then northern Vietnam. They'll conquer Hanoi in a battle in the 1880s. And to make kind of a long story very short, they will combine all of these countries into one colonial state, which they'll call Indochina or French Indochina in 1887. So that new colonial state, French Indochina, just to recap, it's made up of Vietnam, but Vietnam's divided into three colonial pieces. Cambodia, and then Laos as well. I didn't mention it, but they'll add Laos at the turn of the 20th century. So those three main countries, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, make up the new colonial state of French Indochina.
But do the people there, do they consider themselves Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians, or are they one entity, or does the French create this entity?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. It's a great question. If we back up just a little bit, the Vietnamese in the beginning, Vietnam in the beginning. Rick, would you mind going back to that map? Would that be possible? In the
Anything
beginning,
for you, Chris.
well, I appreciate that. In the beginning, way back when, uh, second century, first century before Christ, and then up until 1000 AD. I don't want to go too deep into this, but Vietnam was only that part around Hanoi. So Vietnam was only the northern part. But once the Vietnamese broke away from the Chinese Empire in the 10th century, they then will begin to move south and colonize themselves. So they break out from the Chinese Empire, and then they create their own empire by moving south to Cochin China to Saigon. But to answer your question, Chris, for a brief time in the early 19th century, the Vietnamese controlled much of Laos and almost all of Cambodia. So what the Vietnamese created look a lot like what the French are going to take over, if you follow what I
Yeah,
mean.
yeah.
And so the reason I kind of jump on your question there, if you don't mind, is it's going to create problems later,
right.
during the French Indochina War, during the Vietnam War, and in particular, there's the third Indochina War as well, with the Khmer Rouge and all of that. But it's linked to this Vietnamese empire that existed before, and then the French will kind of graft their empire onto what the Vietnamese had done before. But it's 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 um it's an important point because it's going to cause a lot of problems,
Yeah,
and they haven't been discussed all that much in the scholarship that's been done. But I think the French will create the French Indo-Chinese state, which is going to exist from 1887 all the way until 1954. That's what the Vietnamese Ho Chi Minh and his troops are going to bring down. They're going to bring down French Indochina, but they're not going to let go of Laos and Cambodia themselves.
okay.
Well, so short circuiting a bunch of history here. There turns out to be a big war in the 1930s and 40s that involves
Yeah,
Japan. In the end, basically, although Vichy France is an ally of Japan,
yeah,
then after de Gaulle takes over, they're
yep,
not. The Japanese imprison all the Vichy French people. When Japan surrenders, Vietnam suddenly discovers itself a little ungoverned at that point, or uncontrolled,
absolutely. No,
and
you're right,
that's
Rick.
when Ho Chi Minh and his government come in, and well, he forms a government. He starts a coalition government,
Yep,
a
yep.
provisional government in 1945, and that's really kind of where this whole
Mhm.
modern conflict, modern history starts off, isn't it?
Absolutely. No, you've summed it up well. I would say if you could go back to those pictures, that's Ho Chi Minh, who was opposed to that French Indo-Chinese state before 1945. He's a globetrotter. Mao Zedong didn't really leave China. Ho Chi Minh did. He left in 1911. He's going to go to France. He's going to cross the Atlantic. He'll go to New York. He'll come back to
He was in
London.
Boston for a while, I
Yeah,
think.
absolutely, absolutely. So he's a revolutionary globetrotter, and he's going to convert to communism in Paris after World War One, and that's where, if you look at the middle, the third from the left, that's him at a meeting of the French Socialist Party, which it breaks and becomes the French Communist Party, and then he goes to Moscow in 1923. I'm getting back to what you said, Rick, about 1945, but what's interesting is he circulates on the outside, but he really reads geopolitics well. And so when the Japanese occupy Indochina and the Americans enter the war after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, he knows that the Japanese days are counted, or at least that's the bet that he makes. And it turns out that he's right. And so he hustles back to Vietnam in 1941. He creates the Viet Minh. I'm sure some of you maybe have heard of the Viet Minh. It's a nationalist front. He's waiting. He was thrilled when the Japanese finally overthrew the Vichy government. and put the Vichy troops in jail in in March of 1945. And then, of course, he was thrilled when the Allies defeated the Japanese. And to get to your point, Rick, that created that vacuum that he needed, and that's where Ho Chi Minh put Vietnam back on the map, literally. So that's the 2nd of September, 1945. He's in Hanoi. And he addresses, 20, 30, some people say it's 100, 200,000 Vietnamese who are thrilled to have their independence back. But of course, the problem is that de Gaulle, as you said, he just got his independence back, but he's determined to reestablish.
He's not sharing it.
Well, he's not sharing. He wants the French Empire back, because for France and de Gaulle in particular, 1940 was a very humiliating experience. And in order for de Gaulle, I think, to really be among the big powers again, he needs the empire. So he's betting on getting French Indochina back, and he already has Algeria. So he wants those two pillars of the empire so that he can bring France back to kind of great power status.
But our the movement that Ho Chi Minh will eventually lead, is that one of several? I mean, what's the environment for independence movements before the war? I mean, is there only one, or are there many different competing groups? Or
yeah, it's a great question. Chris. There's you have kind of communist nationalists, which I think Ho Chi Minh incarnates. Then you have kind of social democrats, non-communists, and that was led by the Vietnamese Nationalist Party. You have a variety of other groups as well. The problem is, during the colonial period, up until World War II, up until 1945, the French have a really hard time dealing with these political parties. And to be really honest, and I'm not saying anything new here, they put most of these people in jail, and and those who cause problems, they will be executed as well. So this was particularly the case in the early 1930s. There was uprisings in the 1930s, and they were indeed brutally repressed by the French. And there'll be another one in 1941, and it's the same thing. So your question's interesting, because in a way they never really created a kind of a reformist, or kind of like the Indian Congress, in India, where the British, I'm not saying the British are better colonizers. I don't want to go down that road. But what I am saying is that they were able to create kind of partners with whom they could work. Whereas the French, when they got to 1945, they really didn't have any partners other than the Communist Party. And they found themselves in a bit of a pickle. So so it was limited partners because of the hard-handed French policy during the 1920s and 30s.
I want to stick on Ho Chi Minh for a minute, because we
Sure.
have a question from the audience, and I'll combine it with a question
Absolutely.
of mine. But David Picker says, can we talk a bit about the fact that Ho Chi Minh was at the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919 and was ignored? And I would like to add to that, if you want now, or we can come back later, what is it about? What do we most misunderstand about Ho Chi Minh? I mean, this is a person. I grew up in the 50s and 60s. This was a big name. He was the big bad villain of Vietnam. But what do we misunderstand about him? I mean, it doesn't have to be like that. Oh, he's good and or he's bad, but just what kind of don't we know, or don't we realize about this guy? So 2 questions, David's and mine.
Okay, they're kind of linked.
And I'm a little upset, by the way, that twice you've told Chris he asked a good question and I haven't gotten it yet. But I'm not in any way.
I thought about that. I thought about when I said that.
And it's not the first time, Chris. It's not the first time. We know who asked the good questions. It's okay. I'm fine with it.
Hey.
Well, okay.
Great question, Rick.
I'm sure you're going to have a great question here.
Yeah, one day it'll happen. Just probably not today.
Well, let me get to Versailles here. Yeah. So the viewer. It's a great point. I mean, yes, I think Ho Chi Minh's a globetrotter. He leaves in 1911. And he doesn't leave as a communist. He actually leaves as someone who would like to work with the French. someone who would like to reform the French colonial system. He is a Democrat, a Republican, in the French tradition. He really does believe that there needs to be something similar to what the British were doing with the Indian Congress in India, for example. He's watching what's going on during World War I. And then he's in the halls of Versailles. But I think your viewers may or may not know, but there was others there. There was Chinese nationalists there, communists, non-communists. There was Algerians there. There's a really interesting group of people who Egyptians were there as well, who were hoping that after this war, given that they had participated in the war as well, the colonial troops, that the British, the French, and the Americans would do something. And as I think the viewer said, Ho Chi Minh would be disappointed. He would write to the French. He would write to Woodrow Wilson, hoping that Wilson would make good on, self-determination and that sort of thing. But in the end, I think is that decolonization was limited to the Habsburg Empire, if you like, and not to the Franco or the French or the British empires. So yeah, disappointment. There's no doubt about it. There's great disappointment. And so Ho Chi Minh will then look to other possibilities when it comes to national liberation. Now, communism was one. He chose that one. He did. And there's no denying that. And he will go down the communist track, as I explained in my book, all the way to 1954 and after. There was other possibilities as well. So you have other people who were at Versailles, Egyptians, for example, who are going to try to go down the Republican route and that sort of thing. But it is true that Ho was very disappointed by Wilson, but by the French in particular. And that's when he will create the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, also known as the Vietnamese Communist Party. Chris, there's this confusion again, always between Indochina and Vietnam, but I don't want to go too far down that road because it gets a little confusing. But he creates the Vietnamese/Indo-Chinese Communist Party in 1930, and then he'll create the Viet Minh in 1941, and then we get to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which is the new nation state he creates on the 2nd of September, 1945. So it is a remarkable person, Rick, to get back to what you said. There's no doubt about him. I think you're right. Love him or hate him, love him or hate him. This is someone who was, who's quite remarkable, quite brilliant, and who would lead Vietnam to independence in 1954, and then even further in the end. For me to answer your question, which, by the way, was a very good question. Thanks, man.
I'll take that as a totally objective, unforced comment.
Absolutely. The thing is, what strikes me, and I have to deal when I kind of write about Vietnam. You always have to deal with Ho Chi Minh. Was he a villain or was he a saint? Well, neither one or the other, right? But one of the things that strikes me, two things, was his ability to create networks. That whole time he was on the outside, from 1911 all the way until 1941, he had this uncanny ability to create networks, to never burn bridges. He learned languages, which means you know how to build networks. You know what I mean? So he knew Russian, he knew Chinese, he knew French, he spoke English quite well. He even learned Thai. This is all a reflection of him traveling. But he always had, kind of an address book, which was quite remarkable. So he knew. He met Mao Zedong, he knew Stalin, but he knew also kind of, how would I put this? Not in a pejorative way, but people he would bump into in ports that he was going through in Bangkok or Singapore or in southern China. And he would be able to rely upon these things later on when he's fighting the French and the Americans. It's absolutely extraordinary, the address book that he was able to put together. So that's something that I tried to bring out in my book. And I don't think we talk about enough, is that ability to do that. The other thing too is he could read geopolitics, and he really knew where he needed to be at the right time and what he had to do. And when I say networking too, if you take the example of World War II, he knew that he needed to work with the American OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. And he knew that he needed to be the man who could get in there, work with the Americans, find the pilots that were shot down by the Japanese in Indochina, from 1941 to 1945 and all that. But he knew that he would get access to radios, and I have a chapter in my book about radios. But I get to this idea of networking and radios now, but he was able to tune himself in, if I can put it that way. He was able to, something of a technology geek, as well. But when he took power in September of 1945, not only did he make the bet that the Japanese would lose, and they did, but he needed to know exactly when he should go into Hanoi. And he had access to American provided radios. You know what I mean? And I don't know if I'm going a little bit off on your question there, but there's these little things about Ho that make him really unique. Was he a communist? Yes. Was he a nationalist? Yes. You know what I mean? Was it important? Of course it was. Did he do, bad things? Yes, he did. Did he do good things? Yes. But there's another level to it. And I'm kind of getting on your question there. There's another level that really makes him stand out. And it's this networking, tuning in, both literally human networking and then literally technology. And that's something I talk about in the book as well, is how he wired the Indochina War to a certain extent from the beginning.
So Christopher, when he, kind of picking up on Ho, when he declares the Republic, what's the international reaction, and is he actually creating a government? Or, I mean, to use probably a bad analogy, is it like, the Irish during the uprising in 1916 saying, we're a republic, but nobody actually.
Well, I mean, there's always a little bit, isn't there, of that, when you take over, after when an empire falls,
right.
And, there's always, you got to pick up the pieces and try to put it back together in the form of a nation state or in the form of something else as quickly as possible. But he had that opening, that window. And when he got there, he moved fast. And what did he do? I think he did what a lot of nationalists did, like in, Sukarno in Indonesia as well. He immediately, grafted the nation state, even though it could have been fictitious in many ways, straight onto the pre-existing colonial state. So what was working as a colonial state 3 days earlier or a couple of months earlier, well, he was taking over. But of course, he would make the argument, this was mine before yours in the 19th century. You know what I mean?
Because he had to know the French are coming back, right?
Now geopolitics. I totally agree with you. Yeah, he knew, and so he knew he had that opening there, and he knew that de Gaulle was going to want the empire back. He also knew that, real quick, perhaps for our viewers, that at the end of World War II, Truman decided to divide Vietnam into two occupation zones. And Ho took power in all of Vietnam. But the problem is Ho knew that Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Chinese would occupy and accept the Japanese surrender north of the 16th parallel, whereas the British would do the same thing below the 16th parallel. So to get to your point there, he had to deal with the British in the north. I'm sorry, the British in the south, the Chinese in the north. The Americans, they're kind of moving up and down. They're saying, what's going on here? Trying to find out who Ho is. And then the French are doing everything they can to get back in. So it's an incredibly complicated time in 1945 and 46. But to boil it down to something simple, there's two nation states that clash in 1945 and 1946. It's Ho's nation state born out of World War II. And it's the French don't like it when I say this, but it's de Gaulle's, it's the new nation state born out of the Allied liberation of France in 1944. And those two clash because the empire is a part of the French nation. Whereas for Ho Chi Minh, sorry, this was ours before it was yours, and we want it back now. War breaks out on the 19th of December, 1946, and it's going to be a bloody war until its end at Dien Bien Phu on the 7th of May, 1954.
So one of the things that you talk about in the book is that this war starts, and it's mostly at the beginning a kind of a guerrilla war.
Yes.
But things change. How and why do things change around 1949, a few years into this war?
No, you're totally right. I think the first half between 1945 and 1949, 1950, it's what I call the tiger against the elephant, or actually what Ho Chi Minh called the battle of the tiger against the elephant. It's the tiger fights a guerrilla war. The elephant is the modern French army with artillery, great firepower, and that sort of thing. And so the Tiger, as Ho Chi Minh told it to an American journalist in Paris just before the war broke out in 1946, the Tiger attacks at night. It jumps on the elephant's back, but it never takes it on in conventional warfare, set piece battle. So that was the type of war that was fought in Vietnam between 1945 and 1950. As you say, Rick, everything changes in 1949 when Mao Zedong, the Chinese communists, come to power in China, and China, of course, borders with northern Vietnam, and that's where Ho's capital is after he's pushed out by the French from Hanoi and Saigon when the war starts in 1946. But that's a big change geopolitically when the Chinese communists take power, because Mao Zedong's going to throw his diplomatic weight, he's going to throw his military weight, he's going to throw his economic weight behind Ho Chi Minh at the same time that he's helping Kim Il Sung in North Korea against the Americans who are fighting them directly in South Korea. So, and again, I get back to networking, but Ho Chi Minh knew Mao Zedong. Ho Chi Minh knew his right-hand man, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Zhou Enlai. He knew them from the 1920s and he knew them from the 1930s. It paid off. It paid off in a big way. So Mao Zedong recognized the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh's Vietnam, in 1950. He provided it modern military aid, artillery. Eventually, he's going to provide anti-aircraft systems, that sort of thing. So this allows, I'm getting to your point now, this allows the Tiger to become something different. And I think this is what's really unique, and it's something that I try to show in the book, is that the Indochina War, it's not just counterinsurgency. It's not just pacification. It's not just a guerrilla war. It becomes a conventional war. And no other war of decolonization in the 20th century duplicates this military revolution that occurs from 1950. So the Vietnamese Army, which is led by the famous General Vo Nguyen Giap, he is going to put together a divisional army. So it's not a motley crew, and I don't mean that in a bad way. It's not, the tiger, but now it's becoming an elephant, meaning 7 divisions. The Vietnamese create an army with 7 divisions, including an artillery division by the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. So it's a military revolution like none other than that we've seen. And you'll have 8 set-piece battles between 1950 and 1954. I won't name them all here, but the first battle is the border battle of Cao Bang in let's just say late 1950. It opens the road to China. It opens the road to kind of all the way to the Soviet Union in a way. So Vietnam is really connected to the communist world from that day, from that year of 1950. So yeah, you're right, Rick. It's an important point. It's a very, very important transitional moment in the war, and I just would emphasize that it's not that the Vietnamese are more nationalist than, like, say, the Algerian nationalists. Do you understand what I mean? Or the Indonesians who are fighting the Dutch. It's because there's this conjuncture which allows them to have access to this assistance, to models, and to aid. I mean, it would be like saying, I would never, the Ukrainians are fighting impressively. I don't think anyone would disagree with that, whatever your politics might be. But they also have access to a Polish road, which leads them to large amounts of weapons coming from the British, the Americans. So you have something similar that's going on. Whereas in Algeria, during the war against the French, I don't want to minimize Egypt, but they just didn't have that massive amount of weapons that they could provide to the Algerians. And the same goes for the Indonesians who were fighting the Dutch. So that's a really long answer to your question there. I'm sorry about that, but I guess I wanted to use it to show that there's something really unique going on in military history here that we don't see in other wars of decolonization, and not even in the ISIS, in Afghanistan as well. I don't think the Taliban put together a divisional army with 6 divisions that was able to fight I don't think there's been anywhere else, to my knowledge, a Dien Bien Phu, except in Vietnam. But of course, we could talk about Korea, and we could talk about the Sino-Japanese War, if you like. But my point is, it's a very unique war of decolonization.
Well, Christopher, I want to get back to the evolution of the Vietnamese forces. But before I do, I do want to. There's another side in all of this war, and a couple of things I'd like to ask you about the French, and one is, why did they think that? Well, what was their overall strategy? Because it seems to me that, given the state of France in 1945, they should have realized pretty quickly that this was only going to end one way. But they adopt a very different colonial policy than, to say, Britain or the Dutch. So maybe talk about that a bit, and then kind of what their overarching strategy is. Because one of the things that struck me about the book was just how incredibly brutal
Yeah,
this war was. I mean, it sounds silly to say this, but when you read it,
I know. Yeah, yeah. Um, you know that historians haven't answered that question correctly yet, in my opinion.
Right.
This is something that a lot of us have been working on, both for the French colonial period, say from the late 19th century all the way until 1954, even till the end of the Algerian War. Um, and why did they not seem to have a strategy, an end game for some sort of a reformist type of independence? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Rather than going down a brutal war, first in Indochina and then in Algeria, a lot of us are scratching our heads. Well, like you say, what is going on in the French mind that they're incapable, whether it be on the left or on the right? I mean, even at least the Socialist Party on the left was as involved in this as much as the Gaullist and those on the right as well. I think there's a couple things going on here. Charles de Gaulle, first of all, we talked about it a little bit before the show, but I think he really wanted the empire back. He needed the empire for economic reconstruction of France, which had been bombed and devastated during World War II, access to the rubber plantations in Cochin, China, as a way of getting American dollars and all sorts of things they could sell, and then reinvest. Prestige. I don't think we should underestimate that. 1940 was really humiliating, and I can understand. That was a very tough moment for the French and for de Gaulle in particular. So he saw the recuperation of the empire as a way of getting back in the great power game, and I think that was incredibly important for Charles de Gaulle. He had to have that back. He wanted to get France back among the great powers. Maybe one last point would be Vichy was a problem. And this is interesting. Something I'm kind of working on is that the Japanese overthrew most of the empires in Southeast Asia, right? When they attacked the Americans at Pearl Harbor, then they looked towards the south. They overthrew the Americans in the Philippines. They overthrew the Dutch in Indonesia. They overthrew the British in Singapore, Burma, Malaya, right? We all agree on that. They left the French in. This is interesting. Even though they threw the French out at the end of the war, March of 45, you never had a turnover among the French political class in Indochina. So a lot of those colonial administrators, I don't want to go too deep into this, but unlike what happened in Burma, unlike what happened in Malaysia, unlike what happened even in the American Philippines, is that they got caught in a time warp and they kind of convinced themselves, we can deal with this like we did in the 1930s, like I told you before.
Yeah.
All we have to do is come back. The Vietnamese, I can give you all sorts of quotes and stuff, but we just need to put them back in their place and everything will be fine. So I get to your questions there, is that they walked in thinking, both de Gaulle on one side, because he's the one who said, take it back by force if you have to. So he started the long Indo-Algerian war, to be quite honest. And then he brought back all of these administrators unlike the British, who kind of brought in new blood. They said, whoa, the times have changed. You should have seen what happened in Europe. You should have seen what happened in China. Whereas in Indochina, there was kind of this time warp. I don't know quite how to explain it.
Yeah.
And I think that didn't help the French out in coming up with a new policy instead of, going into this brutal war of decolonization. But Chris, don't forget that right after the Indochina, Dien Bien Phu fell, Geneva, was the ceasefire. It ended the first Indochina war. The French marched off to Algeria, and it wasn't to fight communists.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, one of the things that's kind of interesting to me in this war, this is the French have started out what is essentially a colonial war.
Hmm.
It starts to become viewed, at least in some places like Washington D.C., as an anti-communist war. So how is America? Is America, the United States of America, involved in this war at
Absolutely.
all up before Dien Bien Phu?
Absolutely. It's the flip side of what you asked a moment ago, Rick. When the Chinese came in, it transformed the war for Ho Chi Minh. But when the Chinese came in, it also transformed the war for the Americans. The Americans were kind of standoffish. They kept advising the French. It's like, you might want to think about decolonization. You know what I mean? If we could do it in the Philippines, you can do it. Don't get me wrong. I mean, but once the Chinese came, the Korean War broke out in June of 1950. The Americans reinterpreted the colonial war as an integral part of their containment policy for stopping the Chinese in particular, the Soviets behind them. It's the domino theory. But I would say one thing, too, that I try to show in the book is that the Americans, you have to understand, too, that, the presidents who are going to be involved in Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson, John F. Kennedy, they were in the Pacific War during World War II. And they saw what the Japanese did when they marched all the way from China to Singapore, Burma. So in the American mind, when China goes communist, if I can put it that way, when Mao Zedong comes to power and he supports Kim Il Sung, he supports Ho Chi Minh, they see this as a threat to the American Pacific, if I can put it that way, the American lake, American interest, because they are the number one power after World War II. And so, to make a long story short, the Americans become deeply involved in the Indochina War. I make the argument in my book and elsewhere, excuse me, that the American War begins in 1950. I'm not the only one to say that, but they begin fighting an indirect war through the French now against the communists. So it's quite interesting, in my opinion. They're fighting an Indo-Korean war. They're fighting directly against the Chinese and the North Koreans in Korea, and they're fighting indirectly through the French against Ho Chi Minh. And the Chinese are doing something very similar. They don't want to take on the Americans at the same time in two fronts, in Indochina and Korea. So the Chinese are thrilled, if I can put it that way, or it's in their interest to create a divisional army that's capable of taking on the French. So the French Indochina War becomes a Franco-American war from 1950. The French don't like to think of it that way, but they knew it at the time. And someone like General Delattre, he knew it perfectly when he went in 1951 to ask for aid, military assistance from Truman, and for the Indochina War in 1951. Napalm, that's where napalm came from. Delattre was the first to use napalm in 1950, but in particular during the big battles close to Hanoi, because he was afraid that they were going to do what was going on in Korea, and that maybe the Giap and Ho Chi Minh and the army would take North Vietnam. So the first Vietnam War, becomes an American war, if I can put it that way, before the American Vietnam War, if you see what I mean. So it's a long war. It's a very long war, but this shows the importance of Vietnam from 1950 until the end of the 20th century, at least.
So, Rick, do you want to want me to ask a question? Or you want to bring one in?
Oh, good. Well, you can either ask a question or
Well, yeah.
bring
One
one in.
question I have, since
Sure.
we're starting to talk about the war. You have lots and lots to unpack in the book. But one of the terms you refer to that I found really fascinating was war communism.
Yeah.
What is war communism, and is that different than communism? And if so, how?
Yeah. This is something that one of the arguments that I make in the book is that this is a specific type of warfare that develops kind of in military history in the 20th century. I know that's a big thing to say, but if you look at what's going on in the Soviet Union first, then in China, and then in Vietnam and Korea, something unique is going on. And in the book, I try to find out what it is that allows these countries that are that are run by communist parties to create such modern force. divisional armies, use artillery, mobilize a population, just tens of thousands of people in order to do that, which is something that you just do not see in Algeria, Indonesia, the Afghanistan war. I'm sorry, it is not the same. So I was trying to understand, what is it that makes these communist states so lethal? With the Chinese Communist Party did it. They fought the Japanese, of course, with Chiang Kai-shek. I would never deny that. But then they defeated Chiang Kai-shek between 1946 and 1949. What was it that allowed Ho Chi Minh between 1950 and 1954 to bring down the French in a conventional battle at Dien Bien Phu? That has never been duplicated anywhere else, as I said earlier on in the show. So this is where I really tried to look at the techniques. It's kind of political military history to try to understand what it was that allowed the state, the communist state, to create such modern military force. And so that's where I looked at what Lenin did, for example, during the Civil War between 1917. Oh gosh, was it 1917? Anyways, let's just say right after World War I, 1918 to 1921, I think is the dates. But one of the things that Lenin would do was that the creation of a communist state goes together with the mobilization for war. And he also, Lenin came up with types of techniques that the Communist Party would use in order to mobilize people for war. And so I looked at those techniques and this marriage between how war creates states when I studied the Indochina War. So what are some of the things? What is in this recipe, this toolbox of war communism, to answer your question, that's coming from Lenin? I think there's a certain number of things that are important to underline. One is obviously propaganda, no doubt about that. Secondly, there's these special techniques called patriotic emulation campaigns, competition that are organized. Third, the cult of personality. These are all ways that the leaders and the party uses to politicize the population. I don't want to go off on a tangent too far here. Another one would be land reform, and this is where Mao added something very unique to the war communism toolbox. Was the idea is that the Communist Party will use the army, the police services to go into the countryside and to overthrow the so-called feudalist class, the owners, the property owners, in order to take the land in hand, give it to the peasants as a way of mobilizing them for war, but also as a way of politicizing them and organizing them under the control of the state. Now, this might be a point at which some of our viewers are saying, well, that sounds like, kind of heavy duty communist stuff. This is one of the things that I discovered, is that the communists did indeed use these techniques. Stalin used them as well during World War II, but they used these techniques. They're called mass mobilization techniques, what I call war communism, to go into the population, to control them, to use them to create huge teams. If you remember in my book, I talk about the huge logistical teams because they didn't have trucks. Well, if trucks aren't there, that means you have to go into the villages in order to get people to lug ammunition, food, that sort of thing, to do it. And this is what we don't see in other wars of decolonization, this capacity to mobilize people in massive numbers. And so I'm not doing the best job here of answering your question, but it's these techniques that I explored. So cult of personality, propaganda, emulation campaigns, land reform is very important. And then, of course, you're going to go and mobilize the population to recruit them for the army. Rectification. I'm sorry, I was looking there a moment ago. Rectification. I know some people will object to this term, but the thing is that the Chinese used it and Ho Chi Minh used it as well. This idea of changing bureaucrats and soldiers, their way of thinking, so that you can better control them. That's a long answer. It wasn't my best answer, but it's this idea of a kind of a what I call the war communist toolbox, and it's a unique form of warfare that you only find in Vietnam, China, North Korea, and the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
So, your your book is called "The Road to Dien Bien Phu," and of course, we're talking with Christopher Goscha. Um, and we should talk in our last few
Yeah,
minutes here
yeah,
about Dien Bien Phu, and you know, it's the last of 8 conventional battles that the Vietnamese
yep,
fight against the French. And I want to read a quote. This is a terrifying battle, which you describe as
Mm.
almost being more out of World War One than
yes,
anything
yes,
else. And this is from, I'm so sorry I'm going to mispronounce his name, Nguyen Nu,
mhm,
a quote from him talking about the battle. And he said, I could see the bodies of our dead strung all over the ground at the mercy of enemy projectiles. I couldn't hold back my tears at the scene of such violence, at the brutality of the battlefield. The evacuation became increasingly difficult because we had a limited number of porters. We waited for the rare moment of calm when we could receive our comrades on the hill. I lived among the dead. Many had to wait for days until we could bring them to the lines at the rear. Often their bodies were no longer intact. Many couldn't be identified, for we hadn't even had the time to take down the name, age, or origin of these new
yeah,
recruits. And there are others who stayed on this hill forever as we never succeeded in recovering their bodies. And this is such a universal quote, which
it
could be
is.
from World War II or World War One or the Civil War. Give us a sense of this battle in which the French are surrounded by and eventually overrun by
Yeah,
um, 50,000 Vietnamese forces or some
that's great.
huge number of
No, no, you're
Vietnamese.
right. You're right. Yeah, well, I mean, the battle shapes up in late 1953, and it'll run obviously until the end of the battle on the 7th of May, 1954. It takes place as I don't know if you have your map there with the spot of Dien Bien Phu, if you might want to bring it up, but in northwestern Vietnam, um, the Vietnamese, they didn't want to fight any more of these conventional battles near Hanoi, near the French air bases, near the French warships. So they started to move to the northwest in 1953, hoping that the French would take up the battle with them there. I won't go into the details, but Navarre, who is the French commander of Indo-Chinese, the French forces in Indochina, he accepts the battle in Dien Bien Phu. Basically, it's a valley. I was there in 2019, and if any of our viewers have the chance to go, you really should go. Because you're in the valley and then you look up and you can see the hills, but you can see that these hills are miles off there. Yeah, so that's the valley, the bunkers there where the French were, and there was a 5 or 6 or 7, I can't quite remember, that were along the perimeter protecting the French fortress here in the city of Dien Bien Phu. It was a small city, a Thai village, which would be totally obliterated by the battle by the end of it. But yeah, so you have about during the whole battle, that period from November until May of 1954, you're going to have about 14,000 French troops. When I say French troops, yes, there were French there, but it's perhaps important to mention that you also have Vietnamese troops fighting, you have African troops, you have French Foreign Legion troops. So you have a real imperial army that's fighting here, which won't be the case during the Algerian War. So you can see they're in the trenches here. So they're already in battle here. I don't know which wave attack it is, but they've been surrounded now in the surrounding kind of hills, mountains. They're quite they're important. They're not the Rocky Mountains, but they're certainly uh, jungle covered hills where the Vietnamese have brought in their troops. So you have 4 divisions, that are there in all. Not all of the divisions are there completely, but you have in all about 50,000 to 60,000 troops that are surrounding them. The Vietnamese are bringing in. If you see Dien Bien Phu, it's not too far from the Chinese border. So
The
this
map
was the
again,
battle
sorry.
that they wanted to fight. This is the battle that they could use here. So they're bringing in the artillery. They do have trucks now by this time, Chris and Rick, which is important. They do have trucks, but nonetheless, the trucks can only get so far, and then people power is still important. So they have to mobilize again 250,000 porters for this battle. Here you have the troops. You can see this is a professional army here, and you can see that you have the artillery, which is, I'm assuming, softening up the French positions as they attack here. So this is a conventional battle. You cannot. This isn't this is two elephants that want to fight each other. The tiger is no longer, it's become an elephant. This is something that we just don't see anywhere else. So you're going to get something similar to Verdun, and that's what some of the French officers who had indeed been in battle and in World War One, they had seen this. The Vietnamese are going to spin a web of trenches around the fortress, and they have to go over the top, just like they had to do during World War One. And they will run into heavy machine gun fire. The artillery as well. The Vietnamese are using their artillery to bomb the fortress. And so the force, the violence is shared, which is quite unique again in this war of decolonization. There's 3 waves in all. I won't go into details, but the battle itself begins on the 13th of March. There's rain. It's really bad conditions. It's. I don't think it would be accurate to say that this was no pushover. This was a brutal battle. Giap admits it in his memoirs. There was troops who didn't want to go over the top, but they did. They did, and the third wave occurred. But you can see this was a brutal battle in order to bring down the French. For the first time since they lost in Quebec. In the 17th colonial war is what I mean, a colonial war. So this is a big second colonial defeat that they suffered here on the 7th of May 1954.
So I guess we're paving the way for your next book about the Second Indochina War. Yep. But they win this. This is a very decisive battle, and it leads to French withdrawal. And you would think that given a victory like that, done and dusted, Vietnam gets its independence. So they win the battle, but you could say they lose the war, or the war is going to continue. What happens that doesn't make this as conclusive a result?
Yeah,
as maybe it should have been.
Yeah. Well, the answer is the Americans.
Americans who don't seem to be paying a lot of attention to how effective the Vietnamese are here.
That may be true. I agree with that. Although I would like to know more about what the Americans actually knew, because they were involved. I would like to know what the American intelligence services were really saying. It would be interesting to know. And of course, if they're saying, we should be careful about going to war against these guys, and then if they weren't listened to, then that in itself is significant. You know what I mean? That's hubris, of course. But yeah, I think the Vietnamese did indeed think that they were going to get all of Vietnam for this, but it was complicated for 2 reasons. I would say is that the Chinese and the Soviets in 1953 and 54, as you know, the Korean War had reached a ceasefire in July of 1953. The Chinese and the Soviets were looking for a little bit, Stalin died in March of 1953 as well. So there's this moment where the communist bloc is perhaps not 100% behind Ho Chi Minh. And they're saying, we need to take a break here. These 2 wars in Asia have been the most violent wars of the Cold War, which is true, And they would remain so, at least Vietnam would until the end of the Cold War. And they did caution Ho, why don't we take a break? Why don't we see if we can do a political deal here? The French want out. It is true that the Americans want in. If we don't do a political deal at Geneva, I'm kind of summing up here. And the Americans were threatening, as you know, and I think many of our viewers know, to intervene. They were taking this very seriously. They were watching closely what was going on at Dien Bien Phu. So I think the news sources in Vietnam show that they were not ready to see the French go, only to take on the Americans right away in 1954. They weren't ready. I mean, we know that the Americans are going to wait until, say, I don't know, 1964, 1965, right? But had the Vietnamese not signed the Geneva ceasefire agreement, there was a risk that it could have blown up into a bigger war, because already we know Eisenhower had thought about going to war in Indochina in 1954 during the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. He did not do it. I'm not saying that. But for Ho Chi Minh, the Chinese, the Soviets, we should be careful. The other factor which is important, and I try to show this in my book, is this war communism, which I didn't quite explain so well, but this war communism,
it was a great explanation.
It exhausted the Vietnamese people. I think Ho Chi Minh ran the risk of bringing down the house on him if he didn't stop the war in 1954. Just to get back really quickly, that war communism, don't forget that he started land reform during the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The two things were linked. That's one of the big things I tried to show in the book, is this is no accident. He's trying to do what Mao did. He's mobilizing. He's throwing everything he can at this battle. He won it, but I think at the end of it, he knew that if he pushed his people any further, there could be revolts, there could be just exhaustion. It won't work.
So he ends up, and of course we sort of know the story. He ends up, they sign a deal at Geneva, and Vietnam ends up getting split into two rather than having a vote, and then eventually the United States gets back involved. Christopher, before I let you go, two very quick questions. One line answer. Did any of the French troops survive?
Yes, they got marched off to POW camps.
And did they get repatriated eventually?
They did.
And
go.
Sorry, short answers. Second question. I know you've written a history of Vietnam, but do you have another book planned about the war after this war?
I'm doing a one on the histories of the Vietnam War, from brace yourself, from the Mongols to the present. Yeah.
Oh, good. So a small project.
Good. So dastardly American deeds can only be a very small part of that. But Chris
Goscha, I'll get to him.
Chris Goscha, thank you so much for joining us. Great to talk to you. Great explanations of such a super complicated topic. We were talking today to Christopher Goscha, author of The Road to Dien Bien Phu. And he is, of course, an amazing and highly renowned scholar. He's the man when it comes to this topic, and we appreciate you spending time with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I enjoyed it greatly. Thank you, guys.
Excellent. We got a lot of positive feedback on that from people, and he's just a terrific person to talk to. I could have gone into hour 2 easily.
Absolutely.
There might have been another revolution.
That would have been a good point, Rick. That would have been a good
At that point. You don't think I was overly needy there, do you?
Just a little bit.
Just the right amount of needy, maybe. I just, next week, Chris.
Yes, next week.
One of our favorites, and we do have favorites. We do. But next week, we're going to talk to Craig Simons.
Yes.
And we're going to talk about Nimitz at war. Admiral Nimitz, of course, who commanded the American Navy in the Pacific. And Craig's got a new book on that. Craig is this will be his third time, I think, on the show. So he's
itching up to that hat.
He's on the road. He does not even know it. That he's on the road to getting that hat. Don't forget that you can get your History Happy Hour hat, which we showed at the top. If you joined us late, you missed seeing the incredible, awesome picture of our new
Or we could be happy to show you again.
But you have to become a Top Shelf sponsor on Patreon at patreon.com/History Happy Hour. And Chris, a reminder that all our programs are archived on YouTube and that you can listen to episodes on the History Happy Hour podcast.
Hooray!
Available,
wherever good podcasts are
those
found.
Corners where you keep your podcasts. We're now 3 minutes over. The audience has got to be dropping like flies. So I think it's time for us to wrap it up. Thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Stay safe. Thank you.